Okay, thank you very much, Ian, for that introduction. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I can't really see you there, the lights are quite high. Thank you very much for listening to me. My name is Dr. Julian North. I'm a reader, which is kind of like an associate professor at Leeds Beckett University in the UK. As Ian's mentioned, I'm going to be talking about some research we've done as part of the BWF's funded research programmes. And I think it's an attempt by the BWF to bring research and sports science practice closer and to inform the coach's behaviour. And I think there's a key word there because there are some tensions between sports science and research and coaching. There's a bit of you might argue a bit of a land grab sometimes about which group has the correct knowledge. And I think it's important that we think of research as informing coaching, and I'll come on to this issue later. So, as Ian mentioned, I'm going to be talking about player development systems. So I just need to sort of like get a sense of who you are, just to sort of try and tailor the kind of the presentation a little bit, because this work really, its origins are in how you develop systems for player development. It might be something that is looked at by an administrator in a governing body or a performance director or a head coach. So it might be that kind of level it's generally directed at, but it doesn't mean to say it can only be used at that level. So just a bit of a show of hands, if I can see, if I can just come forward. So how many would coach just children's just children? Okay. And how many would you say are in that kind of performer stage, beyond the beginner stage, moving just before high performance? Okay, so it seems to be about a third. And now high performance, well, maybe it was actually, probably about a third. And how many actually have an influence on the kind of what happens within their sport or within their club and can actually set up strategies and systems? So okay, that's good. That's nice to know. So what I want to talk about really is the systems that you put in place, on the principles and processes you put in place when you turn these champions or emerging champions, how their journey from being younger athletes into being older champions. What kind of experiences do these athletes have? That was a kind of Googled picture of Lin Dan that I managed to find. It looks like he's swinging in a kind of metallic plane come swing. What kind of experiences was it that Lin Dan had to become the champion he is? What kind of processes affected these current champions? What kind of systems on that long, winding development journey? So in 2014, the Badminton World Federation commissioned Leeds Beckett University to undertake some research looking at player development systems in 4 leading nations: Indonesia, Korea, Denmark and Spain. We finished the work last year. Why did we choose those countries? Because they were leading nations. If you do a summary of results in world level competition for the last 4 years, you see that those 4 countries are represented within the top 6. So we thought that they were good case studies to have a look at effective systems. Researchers always like to tell you what they did. So this is the bit where I tell you what we did in the research. We wanted to make sure that we weren't, that we were not kind of forgetting about the kind of work that had gone before, the research that people had already done. So we did a lit review to understand how that could inform our understanding of player development. We were working in 4 very, very specific contexts, in the context of the 4 countries I've mentioned. So we wanted to make sure that we understood any documentation, any resources, any policies that those countries have put together. And they gave us some very, very interesting information. And then finally, we engaged in interviews with senior personnel in each of those 4 countries in terms of player development, performance directors, head coaches, sports science experts, and so on. Now, this work in badminton is within a broader context of a kind of programme of work that we've been developing, and it all started in football with the English Football Association. It was then taken on by UEFA, so we also undertook research in football with Belgium, England, France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands and Spain. These are some of the highest performing countries within the European context. We didn't speak to Portugal, unfortunately, it just won the last European Championship, but that's the way it goes sometimes. And then we looked at badminton. So within the context of this work then, we've looked at 2 sports, looked at the literature, looked at 12 country systems and 58 experts. So this is the bit where I try to convince you that there's a kind of level of robustness to the work that we've been doing. So before I get into the actual results of what we've done and what we found out about player development systems, I just want to say a few things about how we might traditionally think of player development. And I think most people would recognise the kind of analogy of the pyramid. So there are lots of youngsters at the bottom starting in the sport, and then generally they either fall out or selected out of the system, such that when we get to the top, there are only a few left able to engage in performer development, high performance systems. And the traditional model of player development then involves building a number of things within that pyramid. So there is an emphasis on facilities and facilities at the different level. There's the coaching in the facilities to work with the players at the different levels, and then there's competition structure. So that's what you might, hopefully, that's what you might see as, if you just go back, that's what you might understand as being a traditional model of player development. Now, there are a number of challenges that have started to emerge, and this has come through wider research, but also in the discussions with colleagues as part of this work in badminton. And one of those is that in many countries, the pyramid seems to be narrowing. So I think it's maybe an issue of lifestyle changes in terms of there are other options outside sport now for youngsters, and also the sports are getting much better at other sports are getting much better at marketing themselves. So there's much more competition now for the youngsters. So that's a challenge. That's a challenge for sports, because obviously if there's less youngsters at the bottom, it kind of makes a difference in terms of how many there are at the top. That kind of the options available for the sports. There's also the issue of sports science. So outside of the 3 main elements, facilities, coaching and competition structure, we now have this kind of sports science thing that's starting to emerge as an option for sport performer development. And this is, you might argue, produced a little bit of a challenge in terms of how does these new ideas integrate into the older traditional model. So the key questions: how can badminton performance directors and coaches make sense of these challenges and changes? How do we adapt? And these are just 2. There'll be lots more. And what do effective player development systems look like in, as we said, in European football, but also in badminton playing nations? The answer, it seems, to these questions concerns this idea of systems. So when you look at the practices of these world-leading nations in football and badminton, you're starting to see this kind of systemic structure emerging. And it looks a little bit like this. So I'll just read these out to you, because I'm going to go through each of them in turn, but just so you've got a bit of a kind of familiarise yourself, position yourself for where we are in the diagram. So the main components: system embeddedness, social cultural context and resources, clear vision, priorities and planning, clear performance model, clear development model, appropriate training infrastructure, effective workforce, effective learning environment, system is coherent and enjoys stakeholder buy-in. So I'll now go through each in turn, and they'll kind of disappear off the right of the screen as you look at it, and then we'll talk about that particular bubble. So the first one then, clear vision, culture, priorities, planning and resource. Oh, sorry, wrong one. Sorry, system embedded socio-cultural context and resource. So this is a slide with four images of the countries that we were engaged with, just showing that these places have a very different look and feel. So apologies to Denmark, by the way, for the rainy picture. I know it doesn't always rain in Denmark. So when you think about an effective system, it's very, very important to understand the kind of socio-cultural resources that are available to implement that system in. And this involves understanding things like national attitudes to badminton, participation levels, educational philosophy and practices, relationship between masters and apprentices, and the sporting infrastructure available. Now, so let's just pick on a few of these. So if you think about the four countries we engaged with, Spain stands alone away from Indonesia, South Korea and Denmark, in the sense it's got no tradition of badminton in that country. A Spanish colleague of mine came to the UK 10, 15 years ago, badminton coach, was working in a badminton coach in the UK and saw these lines, these markings in the basketball court and said, what on earth is that? He'd never seen them before. So there was no tradition of badminton in Spain. Thus there was no participants. Now that is a significant problem for Spain if it wants to develop performers. So they have to think, when they develop their performance system, about how they actually increase the participation levels. Now this wasn't an issue, of course, in football in the nations we talked about earlier, because everyone in those countries plays a lot of football. In terms of educational philosophy and practices, well, we've all heard kind of stories, shall we say, and I think there is a little bit of data to back this up, that the way in which we think about education in countries like Denmark are very different to the way that education is structured in South Korea. There is a much more hierarchical relationship between educator and pupil in South Korea than there is in Denmark. The Danish interviewees within the study would talk, the Danes don't like to be told what to do. So this is very, very important as a cultural idea. And so when you're thinking about the systems you set up, you've got to be aware of these things. You've got to be aware of the kind of the differences in socio-cultural differences between different countries. And what, of course, this warns against is the uncritical borrowing of ideas in one country and then trying to establish them in other. Now, this has happened a lot in football in Europe, so there are some nations that are very, very successful. Spain, for example, is a recent, have done very well recently in major championships. What we found in England, because England never do very well in football, is that a lot of the kind of administrators and head coaches would go over to Spain and say, right, okay, what can we borrow from you? And then just uncritically apply it in an English context. And it just doesn't work. You have to think about what it is you have available in your country and work with that. And I think it sets up an interesting challenge, perhaps, to some of the ideas we've just heard from John and Kenneth about foregrounding psychological skills in sport, about how easy it would be to change people's understanding about the importance of psychological skills or a funny environment or self-esteem in some countries that are just not used to that kind of model. I think there will be difficulties. So the next one, clear vision, culture, priorities, planning and resources. So successful nations have a very, very clear long-term vision and strategy, often using models to think about how they will deliver their system. They not only know what they want to do from their strategy, they have a strong sense of culture, actually how we operate, how we get on with each other. So that we know a little bit about the what and the how, but also what are our priorities with limited resource, what can we do first? Clear planning frameworks. And resources are obviously a real key consideration. There's no point having a grand strategy and a grand vision if you don't have the money, the capacity, the resource to do it. Another distinguishing feature of effective systems increasingly is research and development, and also consultation. So a lot of consultation went into the development of the Spanish system and also into the Danish system. It's a bit more of a European thing, and you'll see there are different approaches between Asian and European countries. The European countries are much bigger on this kind of consultation research side and research development side of things. Asian countries, they feel it's something that they really need to catch up on to deal with the challenges I mentioned earlier on about the reduction in participant base and challenges that are coming from sports science. Okay, next one, clear performance model. So this is really having a clear view about how we win tournaments. So this is something that's come very much from football. So football are now saying, okay, if we want to win the next World Cup or the next European Championships, what kind of style does our country need to play like? So what is a playing style that wins tournaments? And so a lot of kind of head scratching going on in football, thinking, right, okay, well, do we need to play a possession-based game or a direct-based game? How fast do our players need to run? How far do they need to run? And we saw this kind of thinking emerging in our four badminton nations. But it was much more implicit than explicit in football. So it was something that the kind of idea of a performance model, how you win things and playing style, was something that was much more kind of within the brains of the coaches rather than something that was in documentation. So we now, if we understand how we want to win tournaments, now we have to think about the characteristics of the players that will enable you to play in that particular way. And we've already seen this touched on already, I think, in the earlier presentation. So traditionally, you might argue, and I think it's that the physical characteristics and the technical and tactical side of being the traditional home of coaching, we've now seen a very sort of compelling argument, I think, for addressing psychological characteristics and social and lifestyle characteristics. And we can see in our elite players that they all tick the box highly for all those areas in terms of the elite performance. But as one football coach says to me, if you start to draw up lists of kind of like elite level characteristics for all these 5 bubbles, you start to get this, as one coach put it to me, Jesus Christ at left back, or this idea that he said kind of someone who's so good that would be really, really boring to meet at parties. Okay, so this is an example then of there's a lot of detail on here. It's actually, I understand that you have a USB stick within your packs, and that you can actually look at this detail. There is a report there that contains all this information. But these were the kind of descriptors against the different characteristics for the different countries. The detail is not the point here. It's the idea of the principle of thinking about these things that's the important thing. So we know what we want to, we know what our performance model looks like. Now we're starting to build up a picture of that. So now we need to think about, well, actually, how do we develop our players such that they have those characteristics? A clear development model. So this is an example of a development model from the Spanish system. And some of you may be familiar with this kind of approach. It has the youngsters at the beginning, and they gradually go up the pathway stages. And then there are different programs and activities aligned to those different ages and stages. But what these kind of models do really is just imply certain principles about development. And these principles, through our research work, suggest the following. That there's a clear understanding of the principles of human development. Is it genetically orientated, environmentally orientated, or is some interactionist position? Because it has implications for how we think about development. A long-term approach, age stage differentiation, holistic development, and careful use of selection strategies. Now I'll just say a few things about some of these in a bit more detail. So long-term approach. So we know that most badminton players from the research work start around 5 to 6 years, and the average age of an Olympic champion is about 25 years. So that's 20 years of development. Now most, it seems in many countries, a lot of the more systematic approaches are over this side, over the kind of high performance and upper regions of the performer development part. But what about the systematic side down here? What is your system doing at these age groups? So we need a system that's really going to cater for individuals over a 20-year period. Age stage approaches. So the successful nations all kind of recognise this long-term development pathway approach. And it was interesting that there were actually a lot of commonalities across Asia and Europe about what the priorities were at each of the ages. So you get the different phases you'll see there. I don't really want to get into the detail, but you can. This is all, like I say, all in the report. But it's showing you that these countries are doing quite sophisticated age stage mapping of their programs and so on. And just to reiterate this point, if we know that elite level players have certain characteristics as defined by these components, what are you doing to explicitly develop these characteristics in your players? So the one about psychology this morning, these have been identified as being very, very important to player development, player enjoyment, and so on. What are coaches doing to develop these components? In our experience in the UK context is that everyone recognises this, but actually some of them, they just don't know how to do it. They don't know how to develop psychological skills. They don't know how to develop social and lifestyle skills. So that's a development model. Appropriate training infrastructure. Well, it's quite straightforward, this. It's just one of those things that kind of needs mentioning. We just need a place for players to learn and develop. We need facilities, and all of these countries were well equipped in terms of their facilities, equipment, and also the kind of infrastructure in terms of training squads, sports science, and so on and so forth. Ian Wright, the development director, who of course you know has been on stage, talked about the need to explore ideas of outdoor badminton because badminton is inherently constrained by its use of facilities. Effective workforce. This is the coaches really and sports scientists and stuff, and what kind of systems do we put in place for them? So one of the important things I think to mention is this idea that within any kind of sporting environments where there's increased influence of sports science, that in the nations where there are effective systems, the centrality of the coach is still really recognised. So it's the coach who works around the player, and the support comes into the coach and the player from various other sports science service providers. So that was something that was really, really important and stressed. A clear workforce structure and roles. I suppose that's the idea that the coach knows their roles, the sports scientist knows their roles. That if you have another way of looking at structure is to think that if we understand there are different types of participants at different stages in the pathway, do we need coaches for children? Do we need coaches for talent development, performer development athletes? Do we need coaches for high performance athletes? Do we need coaches for recreational adults? Do we need to think about all these different coaching workforce roles to actually meet the needs of our players in badminton? We need to think about what effective coaching looks like for each of these different types of participants. What is the model of effective coaching in Asia, and how does it compare to the model of effective coaching in Europe? And the research showed there were very, very different models, and it was interesting that move from a more facilitative, athlete-centred approach in Europe, that was a kind of dominant model in the countries we studied, and the kind of Asian model of much more coach-centred, much more directive, but it seemed that there were sort of broader, worldwide, global changes that were meaning that the athletes in Asian countries were now starting to demand a more westernised, facilitated, athlete-centred approach. And it'd be interesting to see how these changes pan out in terms of what is the effective coaching model for different countries. Of course, it helps for coaching effectiveness in terms of that there are good coach education and development systems in place, and there is a great deal of information about what they may look like in a badminton context in the report, and that there are appropriate quality assurance and qualification systems in place as well. That you've got level 1, level 2, level 3, so on. And I know that, for example, Indonesia was using the BWF system. Denmark and Spain had developed their own systems and really spent a lot of time thinking about what coach education, effective coach education and quality assurance and qualification look like in those countries. Okay, so that's having an effective workforce. So all of these things really are kind of set-up mechanisms for where the real action is, which is where the player meets the coach, where they're kind of, we have a bit of an idea of about what we want to achieve over this side. We have a place and a workforce to do it, but now we need to think about actually what happens when the player meets a coach. So common to effective system, this idea that effective learning environments are goal-focused, individualised and challenging. So this is not coaches just putting on the same old sessions and activities they do year and year and year. It's actually thinking about what is it we want to achieve in the session? What is this session about? How does it relate to the performance development, the performance model we've put in place, the development model in place? We talk about this idea of nestedness, so that sessions are always nested within the performance and development model that we've set up between a long, medium and short-term goals. Constructively aligned practice structure, well, this is again relates to actually the different models of training activity, and I'll talk about that shortly. And finally, developmentally appropriate competition, which I'll just go into. So in terms of the research and in terms of some of the evidence that came from football and from badminton, there seems to be a number of different kind of training models related to different ages and stages. So some of you may be familiar with the work of Jean Cote, a Canadian sports researcher, who suggests that the key focus for youngsters up to the age of 12 is just to sample as many sports as they can, and there should be a really, really limited role for the coach. So this is really seen as a training model for anyone up to 12. Just sample as many sports as you can, because all the action happens from 12 and above. So that's one option for the young people. Jean Cote has also been a champion of this idea of unstructured play, so that you actually build into your training sessions time for the youngsters to actually go out and just play, just learn about badminton. And the idea here is that unstructured play really helps to facilitate creativity within the players as a main issue, but also it's kind of socio-psychological characteristics in terms of the players actually organising themselves a little bit better. And that touches on some of the issues I think our previous speakers talked about. And then in terms of structured practice, we have two main models, which are the kind of more skills-based technical model and the more tactical-based games model. And I think it's fair to say from our research from the four countries, we saw more evidence of a skills-based tactical model, but with movements towards a more game-based tactical model, particularly in Denmark, who really seem to think that the way forward in terms of creating elite-level players capable of winning tournaments is to do a lot of development through game-based tactical training. This is like constraints, changing the constraints, the space, the task, the equipment, the number of people, and so on. So these are just, from our point of view, I think we think from a research point of view that these are just all live options that you can explore. We shouldn't be all about skill-based models or game-based models or implicit learning or explicit learning. It should be used to suit the kind of the job you want to do and the players you're working with. What is their next stage of development? So these are just live options, like the coach is like an artist, and you can choose from the palette what to paint with next. This just is a quote that just reiterates a point that was made earlier on by one of our previous speakers, that competition shouldn't be seen as something that's about win and loss. It's a development activity, so it should be set up as such. So it might be that within competition that particular, it's an extension of training almost. You might set up you might send a player into a competition saying, I really want you to work on this within that competitive context. But it obviously needs to be managed very, very carefully with the stakeholders around the player, the parents, the administrators and so on, so that we're not setting up negative competitive environments. Okay, so that's the effective learning environments. And the final one then is this idea of system coherence in stakeholder buy-in. This is the idea that everybody, we've built a little system for ourselves, we've got the blueprints in place, that everyone's bought into it. And the example I always like to use with this one is German football, because it really was a blessing for any researcher who was interested in doing systematic research. Is that in late 1990s, early 2000s, German football was in a bit of a mess by its own standards. It still got to the World Cup final in 2002, but it was in a bit of a mess by its own standards. So a number of high-ranking football officials in Germany went through the process I've just described. They looked at their vision and strategy, they looked at the performance models, their development models, their facilities, their workforce, and really, really carefully thought out what German football will look like in 10, 20 years. But what the Germans did that many other countries don't do very well is they make sure that everyone totally understood their role within that system. The coaches knew what their roles were, the clubs knew, the parents knew, everybody knew. They were really, really careful to effectively communicate what they did. And of course, a few years later, they were the World Champions. So it was really evidence of that working. And I know a few people in the German FA, and if you say to them what was a crucial factor about their success in that 14-year period, they will say it was this stakeholder buy-in, this kind of sense of coherence in the system, that everyone understands how it works. Okay, so that's the model. I hope you found it interesting. I just want to say, I just want to reinforce the kind of point I was making earlier, that really can be boiled down to three main elements in terms of system design. That you do your research, you do your planning, you know what you want to achieve, that you've got the kind of facilities, infrastructure in place, that it's clearly embedded and understood and accepted by in the country you're working or the club you're working, because this could work in a club, and that gives you the best chance of developing those kind of effective learning environments. Earlier on I said something about Ian's programme of research, sports science on the one hand and coaching on the others, and this image is very sort of deliberately selected. You've got the kind of sports scientist looking one way and the coach looking another way. And for me, this is quite a common problem within sports. It's a problem for me as a researcher. I'm actually also a coach, but working with other coaches, maybe yourselves. But you do see there's a bit of a problem, a bit of a breakdown in communication sometimes. But for me, it's a misunderstanding of the nature of the relationship. And I think the problem is, I actually think it's a problem on the academic side. I think that academics are too protective of their knowledge. I think the kind of process of publishing in journals and glorifying knowledge tends to alienate people. It tends to assume that academic knowledge is the only knowledge that's available. It ignores the knowledge that's in good practice in the coaches' brains, within the communities that coaches work. So it's an alienating thing. So I like to think of it in terms, as I said before, it's more about evidence-informed decision-making rather than evidence-determined decision-making. The ideas that were shared to you this morning by my colleagues John and Kenneth, for me, they're just tools that coaches can use and apply to their own context, but we shouldn't be hostage to them. We've got to accept that it's always the coach who's there at face-to-face with the athlete. It's them who makes the decisions. And so this, of course, then puts on a big onus in terms of if we are going to go down this sort of more evidence-informed agenda about how we use coach education to feed in research into coaches, and I think that's what Ian's trying to do. And also, of course, at the higher levels, managing that relationship between the performance director, managing relationships between coaches, sports scientists, so that everyone knows their roles and responsibilities. Okay, so summary and conclusions. It seems that successful countries are moving towards more comprehensive systems to play development around the bubbles I've showed you, the three main components. They generally tend to seem to attend to all the different dimensions and find out how they all work together, how they all connect. And this idea of system coherence and buy-in is really, really crucial. So within your countries, within your clubs, if you're doing this kind of thinking, how does it all relate to each other? Is it coherent? And do people understand what they're doing? We need to rethink the research, sports science and coach relationship. We need to think of research. This should be, for me, in any evidence-informed coach program, this should be first lesson number one, is that research is a tool. It's not something that determines what we do. It's just a way of stimulating thought, stimulating reflection. So it's a check and challenge idea for player development systems and for coaches. Just before I sign off, just like to acknowledge a few people. Ian for sponsoring the research agent in Leeds, for his expert advice in terms of shaping the research. All the people who helped us out with the research in the different countries, and my colleagues at Leeds Beckett University and others who helped to develop the work. So thank you very much. Thank you. I don't know how we're doing for time. I'll probably have overrun, no doubt. Okay. I'll do my best.
Hi, Julian. Thank you for the talk. I'm Manish from Singapore/India. Just have a question about the, if you could comment on the inclusion of Spain in your analysis. Because given that you're looking at models and systems, Spain seems like an interesting choice given, as you pointed out, it doesn't really have a culture of badminton. And even if you're using points as a metric, I'm guessing that Spain's position in the top 6 is primarily dictated by 1 or 2 players. So it just seems like an odd choice of...
I think it's a good point. There's a question, I suppose, about the kind of where Carolina Marin came from. And obviously she's done a lot to improve the ratings of the Spanish within that league table that we just saw. Was she just something that was a kind of a lucky product of the existing system, something that just came through, or a product of the new system? I think it was probably the former. But what it's done with Spain, with the kind of thinking and the expertise that they have developed, is given them the opportunity to do this kind of thinking. And this is like the German example. If in 14 years they're still 6th in the medal table, then what they've done is successful. Only time will tell. But I think what they've done in Spain is do a lot of this thinking, and they've done it very well, and hopefully that will bring bigger rewards for them. But in any player development system, you can't discount luck, good fortune.
Hello.
Sorry.
Hi, my name is Victoria. I'm from Poland. I have a question. Is there like a detailed report that I could read or download or see more specific?
Yes, apparently it's in your pack, on a USB stick in your pack.
Something additional to what was here, or just this presentation?
Oh no, there's a full report. Ian, is that correct? Yeah, it's like a 80-page, 100-page report.
Perfect. Thank you.
Hello, Stefan Luskan of Germany. In the part where you talk about effective learning environments, you mention a different model between the multi-sport model and one single sport model. Is there anything in the research where you can say in this country they're using primarily this model is very successful, or in general for all the countries?
It's a great question. Yeah, so you do see different models in different countries. So my view, we don't know, I don't think, but my sense is that different approaches work in different cultural contexts, going back to the original point I was making. So you have a model, and this seems to be pretty similar in Spain for both football and badminton, where they select at a very, very early age a broad cohort of players and then just keep them in a system for a long time. So it's like it's kind of early selection in one sport, but they just keep patient with them for like 10, 15 years. So that's one model. It's a kind of early selection model. But you have other examples where like selection is undertaken much later. There's much more sampling around different sports. Like Germany is a good example. They would say that, again, I have to use a football example here but in the German system, they have much more emphasis on holistic development of the player having much more freedom of however they develop, and just kind of building the whole person in the way that was described by John and Kenneth, and then letting almost like the system percolate those capable of winning at the elite level. So different models for different systems, but when it comes to the benefits of sampling versus early specialisation, or when you select it, really, I don't think there's any really, really clear evidence, is my personal view.
One more question, thank you. You mentioned also that in many of the countries is missing particular models working in the early age groups. Is there any of those 4 countries that you can say it's way better or something very particular for this age-related development, or early age-related development, also mature development, not only age-related?
Well, actually, as it happens, 3 of our 4 countries had quite well-developed models for the early age groups. But it was actually one of them, who I won't name and shame, that probably wasn't as developed. And that was, an emphasis on just kind of early engagement with the sport, fun environments of those younger age groups. Again, there's lots of different models for how you can run these things, and you really have to decide which model you select that's appropriate to the context and the players you're working with. Yeah.
Just one more. Last one. Last question.
John Gillam from Canada. And research done by Jean Cote, where he had a preference for sports sampling as opposed to sports specialization. One of the aspects was in terms of the losses in overtraining or burnout when you have training happen at an early age. I was wondering if that was in any part of your research.
It was more of an issue in football than it is in badminton. So in the 4 countries we studied, there seemed to be, to our mind, a very evidence-informed, either like intentionally or otherwise, approach in those 4 countries. So there was a kind of chance for the youngsters to develop often with different sports. There wasn't a great deal of pressure at early ages. So actually, the badminton model looks pretty good from a research point of view. In football, it's totally different. So we get for example, in the UK, my own country, we have youngsters being selected into what are called development centres at 5 years of age, being put in under contractual conditions at 8 years of age. And it just, once you're in that kind of cycle of contracts and being offered places, the pressure on the player and the parents increases dramatically. Then you are getting issues of burnout, because the pyramid's like a pyramid for a reason. There's only a certain number of people can actually get to the highest level. There's a natural wastage in any player development system, so it inevitably brings pressure about it. It's just, to my mind, when do you apply that pressure within any system? Because there is a tension at the heart of all of this, which is, I think, probably from about the age of 8, it is a time where youngsters are ready to get involved in more sport-specific training. And the quality of that sport-specific training is really, really important, I would say, from about 8 years of age. So the question becomes then, where does that quality resource reside? Does it reside in say, in the community clubs, or does it reside in centralised academies? And once you start getting into centralised academies, that's when you're getting into selection at early ages as well. So it's and you bring about all the problems we've just been talking about. So it's just a really difficult issue to manage. If in a country with unlimited resources, we could have fantastic coaches in community clubs, and it wouldn't be an issue. But we just know that in lots of community clubs, I'm not saying this is a case in badminton, but I know in football, there's a lot of bad coaching of kids below 12 years of age and above. We just need to get that investment right. But where do you have the investment? Is it in the community or is it in academies and clubs and so on?
That's great.
Okay.
Thank you, Julian.
Have I totally run over time?